Guys, I found out why the Mark 5 has got a higher BR than the Mark 3. It's got an extra machine gun! Morning everybody, and today we're taking a look at the Chieftain Mark 10. This is a battle rating 9.0 tier 6 British main battle tank. So how does it vary from the Mark 5 and the Mark 3 Chieftain respectively? Turret armor? Basically the Mark 10 gets the Steel Brew armor package on the front of the turret, as you can see. This gives it pretty much the best turret armor of any tank in the game, but adds weight, slows the mobility down more, and the actual hull armor hasn't been improved since the Chieftain Mark 3. So, let's have a look at the stat card first. You get the same Royal Ordnance 120mm BL TK L11 gun, one machine gun, because the Chubbum armor blocks up the second one, so they just removed it. 10 seconds of gun 10 degrees of gun depression, 20 degrees of elevation, a turret rotation speed of 17.1 seconds, a reload rate of 8.8 seconds, which is faster than the KBZ and the MBT now that they've had their buff. 86mm of frontal hull armor, 37 on the side, 37 on the rear. Turret armor, 250 at the front, but we'll go into that in more detail in a minute. 86 at the side, 45 at the rear. And this tank weighs 57.2 tons, compared to the Chieftain Mark 5's 55 tons, so that armor adds 2.2 tons on top of the tank's already quite heavy engine body. An engine power of 663 horsepower at 2100 RPM. You get a slight improvement over engine power, but nothing particularly useful. To be honest, that's only just going to bridge the gap for the armor, so I'd say this thing's about as mobile as the Mark 5. A max speed of 43 kilometers an hour, slower than the Mark 5, and a repair cost of 4,864 lions, which is more than the Mark 5, as you would imagine. So, let's go into modifications and then we'll do armor last. The shells you get for this tank are what gives it its battle rating other than the armor. You get standard Sabo, as you've got in all the other tanks, standard Hesh, which is pretty much useless, but then you get armor piercing fin stabilized discarding Sabo with 408mm of penetration at 100 meters on a 90-degree angle, going out to 380mm of penetration at 2000 meters. This is a fantastic shell, and it's going to be required at the battle rating that this thing is having to play at. So let's look at the armor. This is where things get not only complicated but also rather interesting. So, the Chubbum armor is 150mm thick and sloped, as you can see, 150 directly at the front, 120 toward the sides, with the ends being 80. There is a gap in the armor here. This is just the turret armor. Same as on the other side, although the armor is thicker to make up for it, but it's basically flat if anybody shoots you in the side of the turret. 72mm on the lower plate, 86 on the upper plate, and the driver's hatch 65, so if anybody fires high explosive underneath your gun barrel and it happens to either bounce down or explode on the gun barrel, there's a good chance it could take out your driver as well. The gun breech here, 200mm. This is a weak spot on this tank because there is a gap below the Chubbum armor, and as you can see around the gun barrel the people can penetrate. 220mm thick. Don't get me wrong, you'd have to be incredibly accurate to hit this, but it's not. I've had it happen to me quite a lot. Side skirt armor to protect against heat and Hesh, 20mm, 37 on the side of the hull, 20 on the rear, 37 there, and the rear of the turret is piss poor, as you can imagine. So, Let's look a little bit more at this armor, shall we? Okay, so against kinetic, this is fin stabilized. Discarding sabot shells, for example, 450mm of thickness, and against heat shells, 500mm. This is made up of cast homogeneous armor, rubber, and more cast homogeneous armor to create a sandwich, which then is put on top of the already quite thick steel armor in order to create this. The loadout of the crew and the placement of the crew is exactly the same as it is with the other chieftains. Nothing particularly new or exciting there. So that's basically the overview of the tank. I will get into some gameplay and we'll talk a little bit about the history of the chieftain, and more specifically the history of this camouflage skin which has recently been added, which I'm sure you may find interesting. I'll see you guys there. So here is the gameplay footage that I managed to get in the Chieftain Mark 5. I had quite a lot of good games in this tank, but I figured this would be the best one to choose just because it demonstrates the usefulness of the armor, and the firepower of the gun, which hasn't changed since the Mark III. As I said in the hangar, it's exactly the same gun. The only difference is the shells that you have access to, or one of the shells you have access to. Although it does also have something to do with the map. We are on Berlin, which gives me a perfect excuse to use the Berlin camo. So, the Berlin camo, or the Berlin Brigade camo, was put on tanks used during the Berlin Brigade in Western Germany. These were NATO tanks, specifically Challengers mostly. You'll see pictures of Challenger tanks with this camo on, and it was basically just designed to be a camouflage pattern used inside a city. I've actually heard quite a humorous story of somebody running around a corner, they were on a training exercise, and almost ran straight into the front of a Challenger that was parked down the road because they didn't see it. So apparently this camouflage pattern was quite effective. So, moving on to the tank. This armour was designed to protect against heat shells and ATGMs, because basically anything that has a chemical element, which was quite popular during the time that this tank was conceived, which makes more sense than you would think. A lot of countries were adopting heat shells and ATGM vehicles in order to take out tanks with steel armour, so the countries, including NATO, and the countries within NATO, thought it was a good idea to produce something that would protect against their tanks. Of course, the steel brew armour was pretty much just a stopgap measure. It wasn't a whole new tank, it was just an upgrade to the already existing Chieftain. We wouldn't see a straight up upgrade of tank for the NATO forces, or in particular the British forces, until the introduction of the Challenger 1 during the late 1960s. Although that tank isn't in the game yet, so we'll have to deal with the Chieftain Mk.10 until then. That was an awful shot against the T-64, although he continues driving on, so I can only assume he's still damaged from earlier. I do take 1 or 2 hits to the turret, excuse me, which is why, like I said, I picked this video because it demonstrates the usefulness of the armour. That should have hit, by the way. The usefulness of the armour, but you'll notice I'm trying to keep this thing hull down. It is, for lack of a better word, an interesting tank to play within the current meta of Tier 6. It's not as fast or as mobile as the MDT, KPZ or the T64, especially not the aforementioned KPZ and the MDT. It's too slow, really. It weighs too much. The traverse of the hull is awful. In comparison, of course, the actual hull traverse itself is not bad, it's just in comparison to what you have to fight. Although the tank does perform reasonably well in this meta so long as you drive it properly. So the Chieftains rely on their turret armour more than their hull armour, as I'm sure you're all aware. I have put footage up of my Mark III getting hit in the turret by ATGMs, shells, all sorts, and surviving. So the turret armour is where this thing's strength is. As I said, strongest turret armour in the game, 500mm of thickness against chemical shells. Which is why I try to play it hull down as possible. Of course, eventually you're going to get either outflanked or your team is going to rush ahead, kill everything in front of them, and you'll have nothing to shoot at, which doesn't make it worth the cost of admission into the match. In other words, the cost of your shells will outweigh the amount of damage you've done because you've been sat at the back of the map sniping at tanks, either bouncing or killing them, but then once the targets are gone, you've got nothing left to do, and due to your ill mobility you're too far back to be able to catch up in time. I haven't suffered from this problem too much, but my advice would be to play this tank in a sense that works for you. I like going hold down and try to decide when to move up when possible. Of course, you can do it another way and play the tank aggressively, trying to get to places before the other tanks do. Don't go to the normal points like on the abandoned factory map everyone goes to see. Go somewhere else. Don't go somewhere where all the action is. Flank around. Use the tank's what mobility it has to your advantage. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this brief look at the Chieftain. I'm going to call this a review because I went over the armour and everything, but it was short in comparison to most of my reviews. If you want to see more, send me a like, a subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next Warframe video.